Our speaker this evening, as you know, is David Derringer, the Susan Morse Hillis Curator of Paintings and Sculpture here at the Athenaeum. And his subject this evening is Seen But Not Heard, Images of Children in American Art. That, of course, is the name of the exhibition he has curated. It's the first exhibition at the Athenaeum that he has curated. And, of course, the objects of American art are all drawn from our own collections. Raised and educated as an undergraduate in Kentucky, David received his doctorate in American art at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He taught art history in New York at Brooklyn College, at Hunter College, and then for many, many years at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Before coming here to Boston, he was, as you know, the chief curator at the National Academy of Design in New York City. He is, among many other things, busy with the planning for our bicentennial exhibition, which will be held not only in the galleries on the first floor of the Athenaeum, but throughout the entire first floor itself. He's collaborating with our colleague Stanley Cushing on that. But right now, he's focusing, of course, on the exhibition that he has curated, and so I ask that you join me in greeting David Dearinger, who's going to be heard as well as seen.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight to hear me speak. I want to thank Richard Wendorf for that very nice introduction and for having me here to start with. I'd also like to acknowledge the wonderful efforts of Monica Higgins in putting together all of these special events, and they really are special, so many of them, in the greater sense of the word. And specifically for this lecture, as well as for everyday business in the art department, I'd also like to thank Pat Boulis, who is head of our Rights and Reproductions department, who helped me gather, with short notice, some of the images that you're going to see tonight. They will be the better ones. I take full responsibility for the naughty ones that might pop up here and there, some of which will probably reveal my own fingerprints, probably a little piece of chicken salad hanging off one of them, things like that, from all those years of teaching and drinking coffee and trying to eat all at the same time. So anyway, we will make do. This lecture, as Mr. Wendorf mentioned, is in conjunction with the Athenaeum's current exhibition of more or less the same title, Seen But Not Heard. The subtitle to that show is Images of Children in American Art from the collection of the Boston Athenaeum. Since that show, which I hope you've all seen, and if you haven't, come back and do see it. It will be in the galleries until early December, 2 weeks from now, I think. So you have 2 more weeks to see it. Tomorrow being early December, isn't it? Isn't that frightening? And that show is taken, as Mr. Wendorf mentioned, from the collection of the Athenaeum. And as I'm sure you realize, the Athenaeum was never meant to be a collection of images of children or of anything else specifically, really. It's a collection, and is always meant to be a collection, of whatever objects would help to create an atmosphere in which intellectual pursuit could be pursued successfully. That will be the theme of our big exhibition in the year 2007. But as it turned out, the Athenaeum's collection does have enough images of children to make a little show, as we have done, paintings and sculptures and works on paper and photographs and things like that. The works on paper collection and the photographs being especially rich. So this lecture is really meant to fill in the blanks. That is, we cannot tell the whole story of images of children in Western art or in American art or even in art of 10.5 Beacon Street in the collection. So this talk will try to introduce you to that topic as a bigger one and to fill in some of the blanks. I think it's always good to tell an audience what's going to happen, just so you can kind of psychologically plan ahead. And what's going to happen, or what I hope will happen, is me giving you first an introduction to the topic, and we'll actually go all the way back to ancient Egypt to do that, and doesn't that just scare you to death? But it's not as scary as it sounds for reasons that will become evident. Then I will focus on a very funny and interesting painting that I doubt many of you have seen. And we'll talk about that a little bit, a 19th century American object that we will look at in some depth just to get us going. And then we will do a little chronological survey as best we can of American art, focusing on American painting, beginning in the late 18th century and going about a century up until the late 19th century, and not quite getting into the 20th. I had hoped to cover at least early 20th century art in this lecture, but the topic really got out of hand, and because of my own childish behavior, talking on the phone, laughing, things like that, I didn't get far enough into the 20s, but that's fine. That's really a topic for another discussion. Because it turns out that the topic of American art, of children in American art, in American painting, just within the 19th century, is of course a very rich one and a very fascinating one once you get into it. So let's begin with that introductory painting that I mentioned to you, and there it is on your left. I thought I would start with this painting because it obviously has children in it as its focus. It was painted by an American artist named Thomas LeClair, or LeClair. LeClair was actually, even though I'm sure few of you have heard of him, was actually a fairly successful and well-connected American portrait and genre painter. The peak of his career happened in about the 1860s and 1870s. He was born in New York State, but spent most of his life, at least the last 30 years of his life, in New York City. The painting is called Interior with Portraits, which I think is an interesting title to begin with, although it sounds very simple. It opens itself up in the painting up to lots of interpretations. And it was painted in 1865, and we could just simply go off on that and talk about that particular year in this painting if we had time. But it is, the focus of the painting is the two small children who stand at the center of the composition. While their centrality tells us that they have to play a significant role here because of where they're located within the painting, they are nonetheless dominated by the rest of their surroundings. Their stance, their facial expressions tell us that they are uncomfortable and somewhat intimidated by what's going on here. Their vulnerability and helplessness, attributes identifiable with almost any childhood, have been made manifest by the artist, Thomas LeClair. Part of the intimidation is apparently caused by the fact that they're actually having their photograph taken. Although the photographer is only partially visible, I think we can safely assume that he is actually the artist LeClair himself, and he is located, or what we can see of him is located there on our right. The setting is almost certainly LeClair's own studio, which was located in Richard Morris Hunt's famous 10th Street studio building in New York, and into which LeClair had moved in 1863, so two years before he painted his painting. We actually don't know a great deal about LeClair's life, but we do know that from his exhibition record that he was primarily a portrait painter, and that he made something of a specialty of painting children. In keeping with his times, he may have had a general interest in photography and therefore the camera and apparatus that we see in the painting. And it also seems likely that he used photography as an aid to paint, as so many artists did beginning in the 19th century. After all, children especially don't make very reliable or patient subjects, and it would undoubtedly be more efficient to paint them from a photograph than from life. The room is wonderfully cluttered, but we should not be fooled into thinking that the placement of all these objects in the painting reflects the randomness of everyday life. Instead, careful consideration of the painting suggests that it's a fine example of artistic composition. Every object that has been so carefully selected and placed here by the artist, either for compositional or for symbolic purpose, all of this has been very carefully thought out, and there's nothing accidental about it. For example, among the various objects in this studio is a marble, or maybe it's a plaster bust, which is to your left. This is a replica of the head of a full-length sculpture known as the White Captive, which is on the screen on your right. The sculpture was created in 1857 by Erastus Dow Palmer, one of the leading American sculptors of the day, and when it made its debut in New York, just before the Civil War, it was an overnight sensation. The white captive depicts a girl of about 12 or 13 years of age, an innocent maiden, if you will. She has, we can learn from the artist's correspondence and from contemporary reviews of the day, been kidnapped, presumably by those naughty Native Americans who intend to use her, we are told, for all sorts of lascivious purposes. To that end, she's been stripped bare so that her captors can get a good look at her. Despite this, she is blameless. Her nudity is therefore not only excusable, but actually emphasizes the purity of her spirit and her determination to remain virginal, at least in thought, no matter what indignities are visited upon her person. Now, any educated American, and especially any New Yorker at the time, would have recognized Palmer's sculpture, even as it's represented only by its head in LeClair's painting, and that recognition would have made them think, I think, of the plight of the innocent child, among other things. The child in the sculpture, but also children in general. This brings us back then to the painting and helps to explain why the bust is here to begin with. Not only does its own theme connect us to the two little figures at the center of LeClair's painting, but it is positioned so that the captive maid seems to look at them. The gaze joins the sculpture with the children in a common expression of innocence and vulnerability. In a formal sense, the bust, if you really consider it, is actually at the corner of a triangle of gazers. The opposite corner is taken up by another gazer, the artist, photographer, and even though we can't see his head, we know what he's doing, looking at the children, albeit through a lens. And completing this triangle of lookers-on is a painting of an old bearded man who looks down on the children from near the top of the canvas. Now, this old man might remind us of similarly positioned images of God the Father in traditional religious paintings, up there looking down on us. But whoever he is meant to be, he's certainly meant to suggest a hierarchy or a genealogy of descent from one generation to another, as well as a reference to the common theme of the ages of man, the old man, the young children, and so on. Note, too, that directly above the bust in LeClair's painting is what appears to be a rather pedestrian version of the Madonna and Child theme. Its presence here underscores the ideas of innocence, youth, and the mother-child relationship. And we could go on with this. There is so much here in the painting. It is so rich, and there's so many layers to discuss if we had the time to do it. With interpretation of various other aspects of the painting, further analysis of the children's attitudes and their body language, the artist's relationship, professional or personal, to them. Who are they? Are they his kids or somebody else's? And questions about LeClair's own childhood. We do know, for example, that LeClair was something of a child prodigy. When he was not yet a teenager, he's said to have painted portraits of his friends, other children especially. And that is a subject, I guess, that he never really gave up. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, painting children must have been a sort of nightmarish logistical problem to begin with, not to mention the subsidiary problems that would come with it, an artist having to deal with doting parents and stage mothers and the like, and stage fathers too, I suppose. But I suppose someone had to do it. And whatever LeClair's own reasons for assuming this mantle, at least for part of his career, this, his most elaborate known painting, would appear to be a commentary on all of that. Children and his relationship with them, and the very act of trying to recreate or to create images of them, and all of the problems that go with it. As it turns out, for most of Western history, artists really were not very interested in painting or sculpting children, at least not for their own sake. But artists certainly did understand right from the beginning that occasionally children could be useful as symbols or as kind of mood setters, especially in narrative painting. And we can find proof of that right back to the ancient world. Here, for example, is a fragment of a tomb painting from the Middle Kingdom of, I'll get this right. There we go. The Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt. The painting dates from about 1440 BC. And a sculpture, excuse me, there we go, from ancient Rome. So on your left is a painting from ancient Egypt, and on the right is a sculpture from ancient Rome. The sculpture is part of the famous Arapakis, as I'm sure any of you who've taken intro art history might recognize. That is the altar of peace that was erected during the reign of Augustus between 13 and 9 BC. Right away with these works, both these works, we can begin cataloging the ways in which artists depicted children, have depicted children throughout Western history. A list that will be pertinent right up to the modern era. For example, in the cases that we see on the screen, children help to identify the depicted occasions as family events. In the Egyptian painting, a high government official hunts fowl along the marshy banks of the Nile. In this venture, he's accompanied by his wife and his daughter, the little figure between his legs down there. Their presence prevents the scene from being taken too seriously. One might wonder why the artist would bother to paint such a mundane scene at all, but once we understand that this was a tomb painting, once we plug that into what we know about the ancient Egyptians, then we can figure it out fairly quickly. It's part of a series of paintings that would have decorated the tomb. The whole series would record and predict all sorts of activities and situations, social and otherwise, serious or not, that the dead bureaucrat could look forward to in the afterlife. The child here helps to enliven this scene and adds a certain informality to it. With her presence, it becomes a happy family outing, something that he could look forward to in the afterlife. Likewise, the Roman relief is meant to record a family event. Here we see Marcus Agrippa and a marvelous mix of various members of his family as they attend the actual dedication ceremonies of the very altar, the Arapakis, on which they are depicted. The presence of children, again, so very rare in ancient art in general, emphasizes the specificity of the event, specificity being an attribute of Roman realism in general, and this is especially important to Roman art, the children remind us of the overriding importance of family, ancestors, and tradition for all of these people. Without the children, again, I think we would see both of these works in a slightly, perhaps even significantly different way. If we jump ahead to the 15th century and the Italian Renaissance, we find a continuation of these kinds of themes where children are involved. Certainly, lineage is a part of the message of this deservedly famous portrait. Of an old man and his grandson, which was painted in Florence in the 1400s by Domenico Ghirlandaio. But the child also introduces themes of love here between the generations, made obvious by the affectionate exchange of looks, the dominance, beneficent in this case, of the adult over the child, and the obvious difference in age and by implication experience between the two figures. As artists so often do throughout history, Ghirlandaio uses the unblemished purity of the young man to make us even more aware of the age of the grandfather and of this strange growth that makes up his nose, really. A part of the, we don't know who the subjects are or who commissioned this from Ghirlandaio. That's why we call the painting simply a grandfather and his grandson. But certainly that kind of inclusion within a commissioned portrait would have to have been specified by the sitter. Otherwise, Ghirlandaio would have idealized it and gotten rid of it. But obviously the man wants to be seen as he actually exists, and the child simply enhances his age and all of the presumably good things that go along with that. I suppose one must recognize that the most common image of a child in the pre-modern Western world, anyway, is that of, you guessed it, Jesus, shown here in a painting by Raphael, the Madonna of the Goldfinch. And, of course, Raphael churned these things out by the truckload practically. They were so wildly popular once he began producing them in Florence and then in Rome in the early 1500s. Now, I haven't counted, but I would wager a guess that the child Jesus has been painted or sculpted at least as many and probably more times than the adult Jesus. After all, who could resist the otherworldly sweetness and innocence of a Madonna and child, especially by Raphael? So we have to include that in our survey of children. But there have been instances, other than those involving Jesus in Western art, in which children have actually taken part in historic events. although, again, these instances are rare. We saw a bit of it in the procession for the dedication of the Areopagus. And here's another example from much later, closer to our own time. And this is Benjamin West's Agrippina landing at Brundisium with the ashes of Germanicus, painted in 1766. West, as I'm sure most of you know, was a famous Anglo-American painter. And here he relates a scene from ancient Roman history. Any reader of Livy would have recognized the story. The widowed Agrippina returns to Brundisium, which was the eastern port of the city of Rome, with her 2 children after the murder of her much-loved husband Germanicus, who had been in line to be the next Roman Caesar, therefore his murder. The children in this painting are identifiable historical people, and so their presence helps to lay the scene. But they perform iconographic functions too, similar to those that we saw in the Roman relief sculpture. In fact, as you may have already guessed, that very sculpture was one of the inspirations working on Benjamin West as he planned this painting. Again, the children help underscore themes of innocence, familial affection, maternal devotion, and sympathy, although some of that might be somewhat diluted once we realize that the little boy will grow up to be that favorite emperor of Roman history, Nero. So much for sweetness. So far, we've seen examples of images in which children remain simply unwitting participants in events in a decidedly adult world, holding mother's hand, peering up at grandfather, who is the real subject of the portrait, and so on. Children are only very rarely the focus of paintings or sculptures of this kind, and here's one of these rarities that proves the point, if nothing else. It's a painting of the 19th century by the 19th century artist Paul Delaroche. And though he was French, Delaroche had a real penchant for British history, so here he paints the children of Edward IV. It's a romantically rendered painting, and he tells the tale of the doomed children of Edward IV, who was the King of England. The 2 little princes, as they're commonly called, they were locked in the tower and eventually murdered. And here they are in the tower, listening carefully and awaiting their doom. And again, the murder will, of course, happen in order to subvert possible accessions to the throne, this time British throne. The story, which has something of the universal appeal of a fairy tale, contains subliminal messages of lineage, patriotism, and moral courage, if not longevity. But this time, children, albeit famous royal children, are the subject of the painting, and here are given a rare opportunity to be the sole bearers of whatever message Delaroche is trying to get across, the painting's themes, and so on. In fact, as I've said before, artists don't seem to have necessarily had any particular willingness to give children such power in art, even when it was completely appropriate. Take, for example, the case of David, one of the great figures of the Old Testament, the shepherd boy, poet, Hebrew king, adulterer, the list goes on, hardly a saint, but eventually the ancestor of Christ, so one of the most important figures in the Old Testament. And as you know, the most famous story of David's life was his battle with and slaying of the giant Goliath, which has been depicted by hundreds of painters and sculptors in Western history, such as this sculpture, which you'll all recognize. Oh, there are those fingerprints I warned you about. I think there are probably some toe prints on that, too. It looks so hazy. This is Donatello's figure of David from the early Renaissance, from the 15th century. Now, the Bible makes it fairly clear that David was a young boy when he killed Goliath. And I'm sure you're thinking, what does this have to do with a 19th century American painting? Nothing. No, it has something to do with it, as we'll find out in a minute. It's about manipulation and about historic accuracy. And the Bible says when David killed Goliath, he was a boy. And those are the words used, at least in the King James translation. For example, when Saul was warning David to stay out of the fray, he reminded him that, quote, "You are just a boy," unquote. And in most sculptures and paintings that illustrate the story of David and Goliath, David is shown as just that, a boy child. Certainly that's the interpretation given to the story by Donatello. in this wonderful bronze figure. David is obviously pubescent. He has the unformed androgynous body of a child and a simpering expression, which hardly seems appropriate given what he has just done. After all, he's standing on the severed head of a grown man. In fact, this is the usual way that artists would tell the story. Verrocchio, Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi, they all show in their paintings and sculptures, they show David as a boy. Somewhere in here, there he is. But not so Michelangelo. Michelangelo famously ignores tradition and even logic and purposefully turns David into a fully developed young man before our very eyes. And what a man. The sculpture quickly became the ideal image of the ideal man within Western society and remains so today. The child of the story has been banished in favor of an allegorical man who represents courage, masculinity, fortitude, and just plain old male beauty at its peak. The biblical story be damned. In other words, it becomes an expression of all kinds of things that are decidedly not childlike. Obviously, this is one of the great advantages of art. It's what we call artistic license. Well, if you've been keeping track, you will have noticed that so far I've shown you really only a handful of paintings and sculptures that depict children, or not, as in this case. And yet we have covered, I guess, about 5,000 years of Western art. In fact, relatively speaking, there really aren't that many images of children from all of these long years of history that I could show you, even if I thought for a moment that you could endure it. If we ignore for the moment a type of painting that we call genre painting, which was invented by the Dutch in the 17th century, and that's a topic I'll come back to a little bit later, we can state without much exaggeration that for most of the history of art, artists have had very little interest in painting or sculpting children. And why was this the case? Well, by the time of the Renaissance, artists and their patrons held the common belief that art exists to teach and to inspire. That belief was so widespread by the period known as the Enlightenment, that is the 18th century. It was carefully defined and codified by people like Sir Joshua Reynolds. That's how important it was deemed. As England's leading portrait and history painter and the first president of the prestigious Royal Academy of Arts in London, Reynolds was a force to be reckoned with. He believed that edifying lessons can be learned through the careful contemplation of paintings, sculptures, and engravings, and that conversely, the existence of art could be justified by its ability to enlighten the populace and encourage people to be better. Additionally, in the final analysis, art should always be the arbiter and harbinger of good taste. Art's more likely to succeed, it was thought, as a teaching tool if it takes its subject from the great historical events, whether political or religious. An image of dogs sitting around smoking cigars and playing poker has less of a chance of fulfilling a didactic mission than would, say, an image of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sitting around discussing the fate of the world, even if they too were smoking cigars and playing poker. Depictions of great events and great people, it was hoped, will naturally inspire viewers to emulate famous heroes by practicing virtues such as charity, humility, fortitude, loyalty, love of God, love of country. Great events become the subject of great art, which creates great, and it was hoped financially successful, artists. With these kinds of rewards in the offing, artists sought to illustrate the biggest events possible, historical moments such as Christ treating the boys to a last meal before he's led away to a sacrificial death, or George Washington crossing the impossibly treacherous Delaware River to face the vastly superior force of the British. Big stories make big artists and deliver big messages, in this case all about love and sacrifice and patriotism and so on. Obviously, children had no direct role in these sorts of painting. It would be ridiculous to include them. Art historian Barbara Galati, one of my colleagues, has put it well in her recent publication, exhibition catalog, on the paintings of children by John Singer Sargent, an exhibition that's now at the Brooklyn Museum and one that I would encourage you to go see if you find yourself in Brooklyn. Not only did childhood not exist as a discrete subject, Dr. Galati states, but children also did not conform to the ideals promulgated by academic training, which emphasized the figure in anticipation of the production of large-scale works whose recommended content related momentous historic, religious, or mythological narratives. So again, children just didn't have a role in any of this. So children remained rare in Western art, and any proliferation of images of them would have to wait until the strictures of academic art and traditional ways of thinking about art began to break down. And that's exactly what did happen beginning in the late 18th and 19th centuries. After this rather long preamble then, we finally come to the topic at hand, the uses that artists put children to in American art prior to the 20th century. The earliest American paintings were portraits. Although only about 50 of these survive from the 17th century, this is one of the best known and most admired, Mrs. Freak and Baby Mary. It was painted by an unidentified artist who is usually simply called the Freak Limner because he painted, presuming it was a man, he painted a number of portraits of members of the Freak family. This one begun in 1671. It's generally recognized as one of the most interesting and beautiful American portraits of the period. It was commissioned by John Freak, Mrs. Freak's husband. He was a Boston merchant, lawyer, and ship owner. And it was painted as a pendant to his own portrait painted by the same artist. The pair was finished, the pair of portraits of Mrs. and Mr. And I don't have a slide of Mr., but you can imagine him sitting there in all of his wonderful garb, facing her across the mantelpiece or wherever they were hung in the Freak home. These were finished in 1671. Now, originally, Mr. and Mrs. Freak were the sole occupants of their respective portraits, him on one side, her on the other. But 3 years after the portraits were ostensibly finished, their first child, Mary, was born. And once she reached the age of about 6 months, they decided she should be added to the family portraits, and so she was added. And notice that she was added to the mothers, not the fathers, and that's predictable and will remain pretty much a standard throughout American or Western art in general. To accommodate the child, the position of Mrs. Freak's arms had to be changed and her costume adjusted. And today, the ghost of these alterations are still visible in the painting. I'm not sure if you can see any of them in the slide. You can sort of see where her left arm was dangling down on top of her apron or skirt. But if you approach the original painting, you certainly can see these changes quite clearly today. By placing the child with its mother, the painting of Baby Mary represents not only herself, but also the whole idea of motherhood, nurturing, and the loving domestic environment into which she had been born. She was added to Mrs. Freak's portrait because it's the home, it's with the mother, rather than in the wider world of the father that the baby will grow up in. She'll live there and come to maturity. More generally, this portrait and its mate of Mr. Freak are tributes to domestic contentment, love between husband and wife, and the devotion of parents for their child. Art historian Wayne Craven has also pointed out that the prosperity that God has bestowed upon the Freak family is evidenced by their beautifully decorated costumes, which in the case of Mrs. Freak and the baby are adorned with fine lace, ribbons, and jewelry. None of this is mysterious. It's all clearly understandable, just as it's meant to be. Symbols and symbolic presentations and pairings and groupings of people have absolutely no meaning unless the audience can understand them, so how can you miss it? Of course, there are many ways to suggest wealth and social position, even in portraits of children. The symbols that bear such messages need not be accurate as long as the message is successfully delivered. I suppose the message should be accurate or as accurate as possible, but the symbols don't need to necessarily be accurate. Social position can be made obvious by the environment in which the artist places the subject and by the persons who accompany him or her. And there's not much environment in the Freak portrait with just its more or less blank background. So we turn to another portrait, this one of 1761, by a Maryland artist named John Hesselius. Here, Hesselius paints the young Charles Calvert with his servant, who's also a child. This is one of 8 paintings that were commissioned from Hesselius by the young boy's father, a wealthy Maryland merchant, Benedict Calvert, in 1761. The commission of 8 paintings, which is pretty impressive in any time, was one of the largest given by a single private patron in colonial America. And it's interesting to note that this one, the one of the child, Charles, is the largest of the series. And I think just in that fact alone, we're told that this boy with his servant and his beautiful clothing is the heir to the Calvert fortune. His position in the world is assured by his wealth and breeding and is reflected in his position within the painting. His position becomes his position, in other words. The vast acreage that he eventually will own is suggested by the view in the distance. It's identifiable as the land around the Calvert family mansion, which was called Mount Airy, and which stood in rural Maryland. And it includes an image of the Church of St. Thomas, which, in keeping with English tradition, is in a village near the manor house. St. Thomas's was also the place of worship for the Calverts, of course, but it was where they would be buried. It already held several generations of them by the time this painting was painted. The young master, Calvert, is the heir to all that he surveys, a proprietorship that indeed had already begun, and thus the presence of the apparently happy, if obviously subservient, black boy. He might be of Calvert's generation, and despite his dress, though, he is certainly not of Calvert's class. Therefore, he's been literally placed lower within the composition, and the implications of his presence here are meant to be, again, obvious. And notice the importance, too, of gesture as Charles Calvert gestures toward everything that will someday belong to him. Of course, few children in America had access to riches like this, or to land or servants, as did the young Calvert. When children appear in portraits of other people, those people are most likely to be members of the child's immediate family. More likely its mother. Less likely a single child might show up with a single adult when the child is male. That's very rare. Perhaps the single male is a father or a grandfather, but the child is always male. It's always a little boy who appears in a portrait with a grown man. This tradition goes back at least to the Renaissance, as we saw in the portrait by Ghirlandaio that I showed you earlier. But here's an equally charming American example. This one by an artist named Charles Willson Peale, one of the most gregarious and fascinating artists, people really, of the late 17th and early 18th century. It's a portrait of William Smith and his grandson. Smith was a patriot and a congressman from Maryland. He commissioned Peale to paint this, obviously, in about 1788, and to include his grandson. Typical of Peale's more elaborate portraits, it's rife with symbolism, just like the portrait of Charles Calvert that we saw a second ago. The elder Smith appears here in his own world with references to his past, his present, and his future. Smith and his grandson are on the porch of a stately, classically inspired mansion. A farmhouse and mill, typical of rural Maryland of the time, which is where they lived, appear in the background. Smith's professional life is represented by the account books, which are on the marble-topped table. His avocation of gardening, and especially his interest in the scientific pruning of fruit trees, is suggested by the branches on the table, again by those the boy holds, and the pruning knife that the elder man holds. All of this works in another way, too, as a reference to the future. The fruits of Smith's labor are everywhere. The peach branches and the boy, and the peach itself, are all results of Mr. Smith's efforts, with promises of more and even better to come. The grandfather's paternal and loving gesture as his hand rests on the blonde head of the little boy indicates that if the younger man is not exactly the apple of his eye, he is certainly the peach of his eye. The grandfather symbolically anoints the child with the gesture. The child's head is the repository of Smith's hopes and dreams. Where would Smith be? Where would the painting be without him? Body language, notably gesture and gaze, as we've already mentioned now several times, are the great powerful tools of the artist. Few things are more powerful, for example, than the pointing finger or the stare. I don't trust him a bit, you might say, because he won't look you in the eye. Or, you look at me, young man, when I talk to you, which we've all heard from Mother with the wagging finger in our face, combining these two formidable weapons against childish behavior. I could totally intimidate any of you in this room simply by stopping talking and pointing at you or staring at you for 30 seconds, and that would do it. And I won't do it because it would probably intimidate me more than it would you. But you know what I mean. There's nothing more disarming than realizing someone is staring at you, and you all of a sudden, start looking around thinking, what's wrong with me? What have I done? What's hanging out of which orifice? And we get paranoid. It's very, very powerful tools that we have here. Boston wonder John Singleton Copley totally understood all of this, and like so many of his genius contemporaries, like Charles Willson Peale, John Trumbull, slightly later, Benjamin West, all understood this and used these devices to great effect, especially in portraits, which portraiture can be the most boring category of art in the world. What is more boring than sitting down looking at someone else's photo album, someone you're not a member of your family, or looking at someone else's yearbook from high school? These endless photographs of people you don't know, don't want to know, and never cared about, all you can do with it is snicker at their bad hairdos. You look at your own yearbook, and it's suddenly fascinating. Oh, remember her, and she went on to get pregnant, and he became a derelict, and so on and so forth. But otherwise, these portraits, what would you care? The only time we care about portraits is if they are of people we know and or of famous people. So artists really go out of their way, especially with portraits, to incorporate as many symbols and things like the backgrounds, the houses, the fruit, the gestures, the gazes. All of this helps to invigorate the image. So what we end up here with Charles Willson Peale, what do you know William Smith from, or his child, or what do you care about them? But the painting is interesting as a work of art because he has thoughtfully included all of these gestures and symbols and so on. Now, at this point, I was supposed to show you a painting that I'm sure you all know and love because, of course, it's right here in Boston at the MFA. This is not it. And that is John Singleton Copley's Boy with a Squirrel. You know that little painting where he's gazing off into the distance and he's holding the squirrel on a little chain on a beautiful polished wooden tabletop. Copley was so wonderful at painting those sorts of things. But that slide got, well, I don't have it. A fact that I discovered at about, 5:30. Luckily, I did have this slide, which is also of a work of art by John Singleton Copley, and it shows a child named Daniel Verplanck, a New Yorker, as opposed to a Bostonian. Copley didn't paint many paintings of children. There are some wonderful exceptions, but not too many of them, so I was happy to have this as a sort of substitute, but also I was lucky to have this particular one, that is this particular portrait of a child by Copley, because even though it's hard to see, Daniel Verplanck holds on to that same symbol that we see in Copley's Boy with a Squirrel, and that is the squirrel itself. I don't know whether Copley actually owned a squirrel for his stepbrother Henry Pelham to hold on to in Boy with a Squirrel, but whatever the case, it looks fine. I suppose a child could have a pet squirrel on a little golden chain, but within the context of that painting and of this one, the squirrel takes on symbolic significance, and Copley in both paintings is really kind of showing off in a way that he understands this symbol. It's a symbol of childhood. The squirrel would not be appropriate in a portrait of an adult. Squirrels gather nuts and plan for hard times and plan ahead, and they're very industrious and hardworking in doing all of this. They don't sleep until they have enough nuts to last all winter, and they take care of their family and their young. So these are all good things for a child to understand, good qualities for the child to adopt, if possible. So the squirrel appears in both of those paintings. There was more about the other painting I was going to tell you, but since we don't have it on the screen, I can't remember what they were. So art historians cannot work without slides, although I am told that we have to switch over to PowerPoint. There's that powerful gesture again. But we'll save that for another time. And if any of you were here the last time I got up here and spoke, you know all about my relationship with slides, be that as it may. Although it was unusual for artists of the time to paint anything on speculation, that's actually what Copley did with the boy, his painting of Boy with a Squirrel. He painted it to send off to England to prove himself, and it worked. It was a kind of resume. As I said, it was a painting in which he used his stepbrother as the model, so it obviously was not commissioned by the little boy. It was painted on speculation as a sort of resume of everything that Copley had learned up at that point. Charles Willson Peale, whose portrait of Mr. Smith and his grandson we saw just a few minutes ago, also, just as Copley had done, extended the pool from which he could choose models, a pool that provided almost every possible size, shape, and age of relative in Peale's case. Some of these people who could serve as his models free of charge are visible here in his great group portrait called the Peale Family. And when I apologize, it's backwards, but you get the point. This painting is in the New York Historical Society and was painted between 1770 and 1773, and then added onto in 1808 when they got the dog, and the dog joined the family, so he put the dog in the painting. The artist, his wife, and several of his children, his mother and brother, and even the family retainer, and as I mentioned, the family dog, are all here. And the group was only to increase over time. Peale created an artistic dynasty. Access to such an array of human types allowed Peale to paint one of the most amazing images of American art in general, I think, and that is his staircase group, as he called it, painted in 1795. The painting is many things, as are all great works of art, but it's mostly a painting about children, their links to their family, their individuality and talents, and their inevitable growth and maturity. I mean, obviously, these are not tiny children who you see here. They're really more young men. So what were they doing in this lecture? Well, we'll see in a second. For his staircase group, Peale, in 1795, has used his two sons, Raphael Peale and Titian Peale. He named all of his children, or almost all of them, after artists. As had Copley, Peale used the portrait format as a jumping-off place for the display of all of his artistic talents in its setting and composition, even in its frame, which is an actual step coming out from it. You can see there at the bottom of the slide. The painting is a product of the artist's wonderful imagination. It's especially a tribute to Peale's ability at painting trompe-l'oeil, to fool the eye and getting the viewer to think he's looking at the real thing, a real door, a real step, a real staircase, real children. And as I mentioned, perhaps it's a bit of a stretch to discuss this painting in a lecture about children. These two young men are really just that, young men as opposed to children. But nevertheless, the image relates to many of the issues we've been discussing, the relationship between parents and their children, or the transition that all of us have made, that all children are supposed to make anyway, some more successfully than others, between childhood and adulthood. In this regard, Raphael Peale, who is the boy at the right and the elder of the two, holds his palette, brushes, and maul stick as symbols of his already developing artistic talents. And here he is at the beginning of his career, literally climbing the staircase, just as he is figuratively climbing, so his father hopes, the ladder of success. The less obvious message is that just at this time, the father, Charles Willson Peale, has decided to give up painting in favor of founding a museum, working in his garden, scientific pursuits, and so on. He's turning over the family business in a sense, especially the painting of portraits and the painting of still life to these two boys, respectively. The paintings we have been looking at, those by Copley and Peale, are from the colonial and federal periods of American art, times that were dominated by first the Baroque style and then by the neoclassical style in painting and sculpture and architecture. But by the first decades of the 19th century, a new trend was creeping into European art, a trend that would continue to affect Western art for at least a century and a half, and is probably even with us today in a sense. I refer here to the huge and pervasive movement, one that applies to all the arts, not just painting and sculpture, and that is what we call Romanticism. Generally speaking, it took Romanticism a while to find a notable niche for children in its widening embrace. Certainly children, or at least young people, are not unknown in the paintings of, for example, Washington Allston, who was the first internationally recognized American Romantic painter and an artist who eventually became a Bostonian, of course, coming here in the last decades of his life and living here. It's still not him. That's not him either. I'll get there in a minute, somehow. There he is. Paintings like these. The one on the left, your left, is called The Spanish Girl of about 1831, and the one on the right is Italian Shepherd Boy. I think we can safely say that children were of no particular interest to Washington Allston. This was as close as he got to it most of the time. These young people, the shepherd boy being, I suppose, closer to childhood than the Spanish girl, are simply, again, symbols of this sort of idea of youth and all of the romantic, typical romantic forms of gazing into the distance, melancholy, contemplation. So it wasn't, children weren't going to happen here. In this kind of figure painting, at least not for artists like Washington Allston. The next big wave of American painting, and in fact a style that has often been called accurately or not the first school of American painting, was landscape painting. And landscape painting developing beginning in the 1820s became known, and we still refer to it, landscape painting of this period in the United States, as the Hudson River School. That was the most famous form of landscape painting in the United States at the time. The category of landscape painting does not, by definition, lend itself very easily to the detailed depiction of the human figure in general, much less to children. On a very small scale, people may inhabit some painted landscapes, as they do in these examples that you see on the wall over here in this room. However, the human figure in general, and even figures that are identifiable as children, might occasionally appear in such paintings, but only if they have some kind of higher didactic and allegorical purpose. And one of the few examples of this that, with any meaning that we can find in American painting, is the very beginning of Thomas Cole's series of 4 paintings, which is, as a group, called The Voyage of Life. And these are 4 rather large paintings. This is the first one, called Childhood, in which we see a little baby, so tiny you can hardly see him, emerging in a boat with his guardian angel from the womb-like cave that is behind him. This is just the first step in life. The next painting in the series is Youth. The little baby's grown up a little bit and is looking now toward his goals, represented by the castle in the clouds. And the angel gets off, goes somewhere else. Doesn't need her anymore, and turns out not to be such a good thing, because his boat starts to crack up and he faces manhood, and well, you know, you've been there. And finally he gets old and finds salvation. The angel returns just in the nick of time and leads him into calmer waters towards the Spirit of God, which waits in the sky. But Cole uses a child, but its placement is within this sort of Ages of Man story again. Only in the first painting. Elsewhere, in the rest of the series, it would become confusing and ridiculous. Children had to wait for the invention or the reinvention of something called genre painting. Genre, which is spelled G-E-N-N-R-E, is actually a French word which means thing or object, but in the realm of art history, it stands for a subject category. Genre paintings are scenes of everyday life, scenes of common people going about doing just common things or nothing at all sometimes. Obviously not the great historic political, religious events, but just everyday life. These kinds of paintings were invented by the Dutch in the 17th century. They sold like hotcakes in Holland at the time and elsewhere in Europe, and then fell out of favor during the more serious times of the neoclassical era, but then were reinvented by Americans in the Jacksonian period. So genre painting had a big comeback. Genre as a subject category, I think you could figure out, could lend itself to all sorts of things, telling silly stories about people, sometimes humorous stories, and some of these might even include children. In fact, lots of them actually did. It's the kind of painting that had great appeal in Jacksonian America, beginning in the 1820s and really continuing right through the end of the century. We can track the history of genre painting here in this country right from the 1820s into the 1920s and really beyond, as we will see here in a second. Because of just what genre painting is, it lent itself also to engravings, so that many people knew a lot of these paintings, not from the original, but from the fact that they were engraved, and these engravings would hang in parlors and schoolrooms, making the painting and the artist sometimes even more famous. The most popular forms of genre painting, however, were those images that do imply a story, and that can be often a humorous one. And not surprisingly, this is where we find children most often popping up. Themes of childhood include school days, as in these two examples from the 1850s. The one on the left is by Francis Edmonds, one of the great genre painters at mid-century. It's called The New Scholar. You can see how it opens itself up to all kinds of stories and interpretations. It would look cute hanging on your parlor wall and be a real conversation piece without scaring anybody half to death. You don't necessarily need the Sistine ceiling while you're sipping tea, but this little thing might just do the trick. Or David Gilmore Blythe, a Pittsburgh artist, a very strange genre painter, a very fascinating one. The Sly Schoolboy, again, a humorous genre painting of school days. He's hiding behind his lessons, eating something. Of course, children come in here for the simple reason that the general category of genre painting gives artists the rare chance and the excuse to investigate humanity with all of its virtues and vices, faults and foibles, hobbies and habits, ups and downs. Paintings of this type were, as I said, bought as conversation pieces, and so they're meant to be unthreatening, easy to interpret, easy to talk about, and you might even get a laugh out of them. Almost by definition, children are unruly and unpredictable creatures with a talent for getting into trouble and into predicaments that are usually avoided by adults. Bad behavior, in other words, is a predictable sub-theme for genre paintings of children, and there's some overlap here, of course, in these school scenes. Here are two more examples of just children being children, I suppose, in a sense. Even though in one case here they've actually performed some illegal maneuvers. On the left is Tompkins Madison's painting called Caught in the Act, as the maid or the mother or whoever has caught the child, I suppose, stealing. And in fact, stealing on a bigger level, shoplifting, seems to have been the impetus behind the painting by A.D.O. Brower called Mrs. McCormick's Store, painted in 1844. Here, trouble seems to have stemmed from shoplifting, a crime that actually continues at the left of the painting as one of the boys takes further advantage of the distraction at the center of the composition, poor Mrs. McCormick. And there's probably a verbal pun here, too. The street sign on the building reads, Handy Place, possibly referring to Mrs. McCormick's establishment as being a little too handy for prospective criminals, as an easy mark, in other words. And children like to laze around and sleep, as though adults don't, of course. But that and a few other things are the themes of these two paintings by William Sidney Mount. William Sidney Mount was from Long Island, a place that he was associated throughout his life, and that he depicts in most of his genre paintings, such as the two that you see on the screen, most famously in the one on your right. Both of them address similar themes. On the left is boys caught napping in a field. Here we're invited to find amusement in the predicament of these unsuspecting boys, but also in the rather pompous anger of the adult figure who storms in from the left. The artist successfully contrasts again the old with the young, and then sounds a sobering note by hanging a skull in the tree between them, which, in keeping with the theme of youth versus old age, acts as a reminder of mortality. So it's either a warning of behave yourself, or it doesn't matter because you're going to die anyway. I suppose you could take it either way. And then Mount uses some of these themes again in his more famous painting of Farmer's Nooning, another Long Island set painting that you see on the right. Here a young boy teases a sleeping man while three other farmers look on. Youth seems to triumph here, as it so often does in these paintings, or at least maintain some control over the otherwise uncontrollable adult world. But of course, the race of the participants in this rural drama cannot be ignored, at least not by modern viewers. And as you can imagine, much has been made of this by modern scholars and writers, that the man who is being teased happens to be an African American. Not so in 1837, however, oddly enough, when the painting was first shown publicly. Not one reviewer commented on the race of the man, other than to simply say he was a black man, but that's where they left it, of course. The events or non-events of childhood lend themselves to all sorts of subcategories of genre painting. Here are a few more. There on the left is a wonderful little painting from the Pennsylvania Academy called Mumble the Peg of 1842, painted by Henry Inman. It is an image of two boys playing a game. Or the more the single figure that you see on your right, The Lazy Fisherman by John Gadsby Chapman of 1844, a painting that was just sold, by the way, last week at Northeast Auctions. Did anyone buy it? Too late now, I guess. Or the more serious issue, these paintings usually weren't serious, and I suppose one could even think of these as not being terribly serious, because the children certainly don't seem to be disturbed by their situation, and that is a theme of child labor. David Blythe paints a match seller on the left, and Henry Inman again paints Newspaper Boy on the right, which might remind you very much of a painting that's in the current exhibition by Hegelstein, a painting owned by the Athenaeum. Domestic settings, of course, are more likely in paintings with children. These two examples by the same artist, by Lily Martin Spencer, Fee Fi Fo Fum, as Daddy tells a story to the frightened children on his lap. And then on the right, simply Domestic Happiness by Lily Martin Spencer, both of these painted in the 1860s. By the way, Lily Martin Spencer, who is the first female artist that we've happened to mention, and who painted these two images, was an incredibly successful woman artist, one of the most successful of the 19th century. She was born in Ohio, but lived much of her professional life in New York City and New Jersey. She's best known for depictions of men and women and children, just as we see here. And as I say, she was able to work as a professional. She was accepted as a professional, very successful, exhibited a lot, painted a lot, sold a lot. And she said in her personal correspondence, much of which still exists, was partially due to the fact that her husband enjoyed staying home and taking care of the children, which was extremely rare at the time. And so a painting like Domestic Happiness takes on really more layers of meaning once you realize these biographical details. There was a huge market for this sort of image, as I mentioned, in the Jacksonian period, which reached a larger audience thanks to engravings, and certainly one of the most famous paintings from the period, a genre painting, did just that. It was reproduced in engravings, and so almost everyone in the United States in the 19th century knew of it, and many of us still do today. It's by George Caleb Bingham, the Missouri artist, and it's called Fur Traders Descending the Missouri. It's in the Metropolitan Museum now and was painted in about 1845. It is ostensibly a genre painting, which is actually rather rare for Bingham. He was really more interested in local politics and in painting just the working people, the men on the flatboats and so on and so on. But here he paints a fur trader, not a very successful one, I guess, descending the Missouri after having hunted, and accompanying him in the center of the painting, and I think the placement is important, is his son. At least that's what Bingham tells us. He painted what Bingham called the fur trader's half-breed son. That is, his mother was a Native American, and the child obviously is working with the father as his happy assistant. Again, there's no sense of displeasure or child abuse here at all. In fact, it's a beautiful, pleasant, calm, contemplative scene. It also is a marvel in classical or neoclassical composition. But the boy is an integral part of it. The most famous painter of children in a genre setting, far outstripping even Bingham, who had a great deal of popularity at the time and still does, and almost anyone else in that regard, was Winslow Homer. Homer began his career producing images for wood engravings for magazines like Harper's during the 1860s, and he ended it after the turn of the century by painting the windswept rocky coast of Maine. So he had a long, fascinating trajectory of development as an artist, a development that never really stopped or gave up, and that's why he was famous during his own life, and his fame has never wilted. But during the 1870s, he concentrated on genre paintings and produced hundreds of oils and watercolors of children, becoming the quintessential painter of American children. And we still recognize him as that today. In fact, many people don't realize that he painted anything else, when in fact, of course, he did. But during the 1870s, this was his specialty. It's almost as though he planned each decade. Now I'll do this. Okay, it's December 31st. 1879, I'm going to start painting seascapes or something. I mean, it wasn't that rigid, but you almost get the sense that it was. He certainly was a very clever businessman, so he knew what the market would bear. And often his genre paintings are quite simple, as in this one called The Country School of 1873. In fact, his work in this area differed greatly from that of most genre painters. For one thing, there's little humor in Homer's paintings, implied or otherwise. That's not to say that they're overly serious or melancholy. They just don't need to rely on parables or silly situations to get their point across, or even give their immediate and lasting fame, or to get attention, which they certainly got. Even when he depicts a game, as he does so famously here in Snap the Whip of 1872, and of course a game is by definition lighthearted, fun, amusing. The careful structure of his paintings and the almost classical arrangement of figures given in works like this gives it an unpredicted and almost mysterious seriousness, or at least a mysterious quality. And again, this is the best known example of that. These are not so much carefree children as they are carefully choreographed figures involved in a complicated and highly expressive dance, which could have been staged by the likes of Martha Graham in the next century, minus the flowing costumes, of course. And of course they are choreographed, that is. Homer's fascination with composition, balance, and harmony, and his great talent at achieving it without destroying the naturalness of his subjects is remarkable, notably as it takes form in some of his simplest images, such as this one called Nooning of about 1872. Its simplicity, its lack of any kind of narrative at all, reminds us of Vermeer at his best, a painting from which you can hardly eke any kind of story unless you just totally make it up. It really is figure painting for its own sake, painting the human figure just to make it part of a pleasing composition and perhaps a recording of a moment in life. This is carried forward in a kind of sweeter, almost a saccharine manner by an artist named John George Brown. John George Brown landed upon a formula and, unlike Homer, never changed it. You can find paintings by Brown from the 1870s, 80s, 90s, right up until the early 20th century that look just like this. On the left is Muscle Man, and on the right, Boy with His Dog, the latter one painted in 1903. So genre painting was alive and well, thanks to incredibly prolific artists like John George Brown. And then continuing, of course, right down to modern times, in the recently recognized, in a sense, recognized as a real artist of Norman Rockwell, Day in the Life of a Little Girl from 1952 and Girl at a Mirror from 2 years later, both of which appeared on the cover of Saturday Evening Post. And scholars, as I said, have recently begun to acknowledge that there might have been more to look at and or analyze in the work of Winslow Homer's and Brown's artistic descendant, who is Norman Rockwell. But we can leave that for another time and another person. Meanwhile, children continued to appear in portraiture, and like their adult counterparts, were given ever more lavish treatment in the late 19th century as the nouveau riche and the robber barons of that period sought to glorify themselves and their offspring. After all, the grand houses in Newport and along Fifth Avenue in New York City were built in the second half of the century, were built in emulation of French chateaux and great English country houses, and they needed the proper adornments and furnishings and so on. This included grand manner portraits, a specialty of the famous and highly successful painter John Singer Sargent, who I don't need to tell Bostonians much about at all. One of his paintings is staring at me from the next room, as a matter of fact, I'm happy to say. Just suffice it to say that from the 1880s, really until his death in 1925, Sargent was recognized as one of the greatest living portrait painters and certainly the quintessential portrait painter of society portraits. His reputation suffered in the decades after his death. He was even ridiculed by many critics and art historians. But in the past 30 years, his work has gained a new respect even among tough-minded art historians, not only for his visually stimulating brushwork, but especially for his accurate understanding of the foibles of humanity, something that 50 years ago no one would even have acknowledged or recognized. It turns out Sargent really did understand the vagaries of interpersonal relationships. And I don't think that that is anywhere more apparent than in images by him, such as his famous Madame X, Madame Gautreau of 1884, and in group portraits such as the Wyndham Sisters of 1899, both of these in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. However, this ability to capture human character even in a more complicated portrait such as that of the Wyndham Sisters, seems to have broken down when it came to depicting children. As I mentioned to you earlier, there is a show at the Brooklyn Museum right now which looks carefully at his portraits of children, so he painted quite a few. But somehow they strike me as odd at best, or quite often odd. They don't seem to be odd when he deals with a single figure, as he does with Dorothy of 1900. I was going to wear that outfit tonight, but I thought it might be a little over the top. And I've also outgrown it, so it would have looked strange. But when we get to more complicated portraits of children, I mean, he doesn't have any problem with complicated portraits of adults, as we just saw in the Wyndham Sisters, and we could see in so many other group portraits by him. Once he starts adding children, and or they play a significant role within the portrait, he starts to get into, I don't know if trouble is the right word, but it's certainly, there certainly is a discomfort here, which I don't think is always intentional. For example, here he is painting Edouard and Marie-Louise Péleron. They were the children of one of his big patrons of 1881 and was commissioned by their father. The painting took over 80 sittings to complete, a fact that hints at the problems that Sargent had in painting it. I mean, it took a lot of sittings to have your portrait painted by Sargent anyway, but 80 over 80 was a lot, even for him. The children, especially the boy, Edouard, were sullen and uncooperative during the sittings. They did not want to wear the clothing that Sargent had selected for them, and that's usually what he did. He would pick the clothing even for the great ladies of society. And the children constantly quarreled and bickered with each other and even with Sargent. Consequently, and not surprisingly, the boy in the painting has a sullen expression, and it appears that Sargent gave up at attempting to integrate the pair, finally painting them separately, as though he is painting two independent portraits of unrelated individuals. So this flies in the face of everything that artistic composition requires. This isolation is a hint of the problem Sargent would have with later images of children and the seemingly psychologically driven compositions that he would devise. Mrs. Karl Mayr and her children of 1896. Yeah, but not Mary. Well, let's stick with her, or them. As I said, painted in 1896. This is Mrs. Karl Mayr, a wealthy New Yorker, and her two children. It is one of the most inventive and fantastic of Sargent's portrait compositions, really. Our point of view is as though from a ladder looking down on the figures. Mrs. Mayr has her feet, her little tiny feet, propped up on a stool, and we're looking down at her. Most of the painting is, or half the painting, is taken up by her fabulous dress, which was probably all Sargent's idea. A contemporary critic quipped that with portraits such as this, Sargent makes us, quote, feel that these people must go to bed in satin and live upon ices and water biscuits. Now, the focus is definitely on the lady of the house. Meanwhile, her children are almost an afterthought for both the artist and, it would seem, for her, too, for their mother. The girl and boy are compressed into the background of the painting, and the attempt to integrate them into it is rather unconvincing. That is, with that gesture of the mother, she reaches out almost as an afterthought to, oh yeah, I forgot you all were back there, you have to be part of the painting. It's almost as though she has extended, and excuse the analogy, an unsevered umbilical cord toward them to bring them back into the fold, as though they had been neglected, and it appears they had been. They are, it would appear, about as superficial as the furniture and the clothes. Now, I'm sure none of this was conscious on the mother's part, and nor would she have acknowledged it, but I don't see how we can avoid it given the oddity of the composition. Well, let's see. No. I don't want to talk about Mary Cassatt, but she knows that, and that's why she keeps coming up there. Let's try this. Maybe this will work. Oh, there she is. And, I mean, much of the same thing is going on here. What is the story, after all, about the disembodied head of that poor child? This is Mrs. Fisk Warren and her daughter Rachel, painted in 1903. It almost looks like Mrs. Fisk Warren is not only doubly named, but also doubly headed. It's kind of hard to tell where the child stops and she begins. Now, granted, this is not unrelated to images of the mother and child of Mary and Jesus, or Jesus as a little boy with his head resting on her shoulder. But somehow here it just doesn't work. And I mean, this is coming from a brilliant painter who knew how to compose, who knew how to bring things together, and somehow he just can't make it work. Or he doesn't want to make it work. Who knows what the truth is. But this portrait and the one that I just showed you have always disturbed me because I've never been able to fit them within what I know about Sargent's abilities or desires. So maybe there's a lot more going on here than we do know. And then I have a confession to make. I can't stand Mary Cassatt. Don't tell anybody. There are many of my colleagues who would just never speak to me again. I was going to show you, it's a painting you don't need to see because you can see it. Oh, there it is. You can see it any day that you like at the MFA, and that, of course, is Sargent's great painting of the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. And so much has been written about this, and it's been analyzed so much that I'm not going to really say much about it. The oddities of it are obvious, I think. There's an awful lot going on here, both in the relationship that the children actually had to each other and the relationship that Sargent had to them. I've always wondered what the standing child, the one in the middle, the one who's leaning against the vase, what in the world must she have thought when this painting was brought home and displayed in the Boyd house, because she just simply disappears. She's not there. And maybe that's what she wanted, but that's all part of the oddity of this as well. And again, the children are really divided up. It's as though Sargent just simply couldn't figure out a way of bringing them together, nonetheless, or didn't want to, or didn't bring them together on purpose in order to make these kind of psychological points. Nonetheless, it is beautifully painted and beautifully composed. This conclusion that Sargent just couldn't paint children because I think it's really because for him, children just simply had not arrived at a point in life where they really had developed their characters, their individuality. They were non-people in a way, or they were people in training who hadn't quite gotten there yet. And he loved to paint character and personality and good and bad in his people. And children just didn't always have it, or it was smothered up by their impatience or the other, throwing temper tantrums. It just didn't give him the chance to really find out who they were, because they didn't know who they were themselves. And I think that's why most of this doesn't quite work out, or not in the way that it does in his paintings of adults. And I think this conclusion might be supported if we consider the career of another American artist who was working at about the same time as Sargent, and that is Thomas Eakins. Eakins, who was from Philadelphia, had a fascination with human character that was so intense that it superseded almost everything else, including the usual artistic effort to land major commissions and thereby to make money. Eakins was not a wealthy person, but he just couldn't be bothered too much with getting commissions. He just painted the figure for its own sake, as he did here in this wonderful image of his wife of 1884. But he rarely painted children. Off the top of my head, I can only think of one image by Eakins of a child, and it's not a very successful one. It is adults that he's interested in, and that is, again, because, and in this case we can say without any hesitation, it's the human character that he is interested in, the personality. In fact, so much so that this painting became a document. The painting aged as she aged. He started painting it when she was young. When she got sick and older, he came back and he redid it and made her older and older as the years went on. I wonder what she thought about that. But this whole idea of painting the figure for its own sake, not as a genre image or a portrait. We don't even need to know the identity of most of the people in Eakins' paintings because they're really not portraits. This category of figure painting, painting the human figure for its own sake, really is the beginning, or one of the beginnings, of modern art. And it includes Mary Cassatt and the Impressionists. Mary Cassatt famously in her painting of Girl in a Blue Chair. Again, we don't know who she is. She may have even been a hired model, which Mary Cassatt did when she got to France. She would hire even children models. Sometimes they were members of her own family, but not usually and not necessarily. And this sort of idea of painting the human figure for itself continued into the late 19th century with artists such as Frank Duveneck, and then after the turn of the century with artists who were members of the so-called Ashcan school, Robert Henri with his Little Dutch Girl, George Luke's Portrait of a Young Girl in White, and George Bellows. You take the kids and multiply by 42 and you have 42 kids, and so that's what he painted. But this group, which is obviously well worth pursuing in the context of a lecture like this, really does belong to the 20th century, and we'll just have to wait for another day. But I wanted to end with one painting that I just simply can't resist, even though it's painted in 1939, and this is Grant Wood's Parson Weems' Fable, painted in 1939, taken from and making fun of Parson Weems' early biography of Washington, from which the famous but a totally apocryphal story of the cherry tree was made popular. As you know, Washington supposedly cut down the cherry tree, was caught by his father, lied, and then finally admitted what he did, promising never to lie again. So it's a history painting in a sense. It's a genre painting if you consider it everyday life as George Washington running around with a hatchet. It also is a literary painting with Parson Weems standing up there pulling back the curtain and revealing to you his own lies. He obviously did not learn the lesson from Washington. And as we know, Washington goes on to great, glorious things, just as Jesus in the Madonna and Child pictures. We don't need to know the rest of the story. We know it just looking at him and his mother and their sweetness and their beauty and their youth. We know what happens next. And we know what happens next here, too. The child grows up and becomes famous. But maybe we wouldn't understand that if he had not already grown up from the neck up. So we have this really absurd rendition by Grant Wood, who, of course, is making fun of all kinds of things, not only Parson Weems, but overly zealous patriotism and so on and so forth. And after that, what else can I say? I was, as I mentioned earlier, have been performing rather childishly myself and not doing my duty by actually finishing this lecture, and I know you're just so sad about that, which means that we only came to page 31, and pages 32 through, 200, we'll have to wait till next time. So. Thank you. Now, we're running very late, but I will take a few questions, and then we'll go out and drink and eat, and anyone else who would like to discuss your life with me, you can do that out there. But does anyone have any sort of general questions at the moment? Yes, ma'am.
Well, in that aspect, when you showed the Roman sculpture, I thought there was a very Roman sculpture of a boy in the center front.
The question has to do with the Roman relief sculpture from the Areopagus and its depiction of children, and there are actually several children in there. I think they're all male, but there also happens to be an image of a little person, an adult who grew no taller than that, which simply adds to the variety, the specificity, and the reality of the situation. That's how far the Romans were willing to go to make it as real as possible. But there are definitely children in there, and that's part of the reality, which at the time was just almost unheard of, especially in a great monument as that was supposed to be. That was a great work of public art that was erected on the Campus Martius and was visible to any Roman walking by. And to put children into something as serious as that was simply unheard of, but that's how far the Romans were willing to go to make it right. Anyone else? Well, I want to hear laughter and the clink of glasses in the next 5 minutes. I'll see you outside.